Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Be sure to check us out online at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now enjoy this edition of the Midweek Podcast.
So this is the Where Did the Road Go Midweek Podcast, and we have Micah Hanks back with us. How are you, Micah?
I'm doing great, Soraya. It's always good to catch up and chat with you.
And this comes on a month out from your end of your Paradigm Fest conference this year. And how did that go?
Well, it went real well, and as I was, and full disclosure here, Soraya and I tend to catch up a bit before we do our programs, and so I had a moment of utter fear and realization just a few minutes ago, where I came to this determination here that since Paradigm, I hadn't really significantly, aside from shooting off emails, sat down and talked with you about this. And I think I'm literally still getting caught up after Paradigm Symposium. I mean, it's an earth-shaking experience to be in the same room for several days with John Ward and Scotty Roberts, and of course this year some of our speakers, Dr. Robert Schoch, Robert Bavall, all the important guys named Robert apparently, along with Dan Madsen, the skeptic, the arch skeptic, the leader of the skeptic movement, according to some, Mr. P.Z. Myers, while other skeptics actually renounce him completely and call him Mr. Sassy Magoo. I didn't come up with that nickname. Sharon Hill of Doubtful News actually did. But yeah, it was a melting pot and a mixture of very interesting people. Sarai, you need to come to a Paradigm Symposium sometime.
Oh, I know. And you are doing it again next year, right?
I'm proud to announce. Oh yeah, we didn't get to that yet, but I'll tell you that. Yeah, we've certainly announced. As a matter of fact, we're already selling a lot of tickets. It tends to be a cumulative kind of an effect, like a snowball rolling down a hill. And with Paradigm Symposium, the first one was really big. This year appealed to a slightly, I considered it very much the same sort of demographic, because we were still tackling ancient mysteries, but it wasn't so much ancient aliens. It was more just the ancient mysteries. And it was kind of funny because P.Z. Myers came to this event, again being a skeptic, kind of expecting that he was going to have to be, fighting off ancient alien theorists with a sword. And I would say that maybe the majority of the people who were there, necessarily weren't interested in UFOs or an quote-unquote alien component to all this. And his lecture was geared toward debunking ancient alien theories, whereas the speakers who were there present, who were giving their lectures on ancient mysteries, I know Robert Schoch and Robert Bavall, they might not rule out the possibility that aliens somehow fit into this. I wouldn't either. But none of us, the three of us and many of those in attendance otherwise, none of us really necessarily advocate an ancient alien hypothesis. I don't even think that there's direct evidence that extraterrestrial beings could be directly equated with UFOs. And that may sound strange, but even Whitley Strieber and some of the better-known people who are alleged alien abductees have questioned that just as well. And so that's what I find fascinating, is that, it really comes down to a matter of semantics and how we define these different things. We look at, for instance, the definition of what alien actually means, and it is something that is so apart from the norm that it cannot be considered a part of the consensus viewpoint, which is utilizing, that is an alien subject, using it in that kind of terminology. But if we apply that to an entity or a being, an alien does not have to be necessarily extraterrestrial, you see. So I am open-minded to the possibility that humankind has maintained contact with what we might presume to be alien intelligence. That is a possibility. And some of our leading cosmologists and radio astronomers and physicists entertain that possibility just as well. But whether or not that we have actual proof of it is an entirely different matter. And I think the skeptics come to an event like Paradigm Symposium presuming that we're all ancient alien theorists. It's not really the case, but we've entertained speakers in the past to have advocated those viewpoints.
Now, would you really call PZ a skeptic, or is he more that he's already a skeptic means you question everything.
Right.
He sounds more of the, I already know what's true, I already have all the answers, I'm more of a debunker type of person.
Yeah, he's that. His self-proclaimed title, and when I gave the introduction for him at the event, I said he is a self-described confrontationalist. And again, I think Benjamin Grundy, a friend of mine who hosts a well-known podcast in Australia, referred to him as being rather than a debunker, a cynic. I've known skeptics in the past who have worn like a badge, and proudly so, their cynical viewpoints and espouse that they are cynical skeptics. And I think to myself, we can all, laugh at a person on, primetime television who is a cynical political pundit who basically, more than actually creating a philosophical argument that counters the other side, they sit there and they, like Bill Maher or like, even a lot of the the so-called newsmen and women on Fox News. I mean, either side will sit there and they'll do more in terms of making fun of the other side than they do actually trying to rebut an opinion philosophically. I see that people who call themselves self-proclaimed skeptics, cynics, and confrontationalists in this field are more the pundits who are entertainers in that field rather than people who are actually trying to bring something scientific to the argument. PZ certainly brings some science to the argument. It's not to say at all that he is merely a figurehead or a personality, but I see that there's the PZ Myers that's off stage, and there's the PZ Myers who's on stage. On stage, interestingly, he was more the scientist. He was more the person who was presenting facts and evidence. Off stage, it should be the opposite, I think, but off stage, PZ was this person who, when you try to walk up to him and talk with him, he made it very clear, we can talk, we are not friends, there is a wall. And I quote, he said, anything you say to me will end up on my blog. When I said, well, I'm a skeptic as well, and it's good to meet you. If you say you're a skeptic, you say so. I doubt that. We'll see. We'll see if we talk, if I choose to talk to you.
You seem to fit more the actual definition of skeptic than someone like that does.
I think so, and I think you do too. I think you and I are both people who question. Joe Rogan. A lot of people criticize Joe Rogan, but I think, Joe Rogan, he doesn't have to have a PhD to be a person. And yes, he's also someone who brings a lot of satire and humor to this. But I like Joe, and I like the fact that Joe...
He has a good balance of it.
He does. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to be a person who is naturally questioning and who says, and with his program, I recognize it's not all Joe pulling all the strings here. There are producers and people who help him question everything. But at very least, he puts his name behind a program that is saying, okay, let's look at both sides, but then let's see what the evidence actually says.
Yeah, I haven't actually seen his cable show yet.
It's pretty good. I mean, I've seen only a few episodes. There was a UFO episode that my friend Jason McClellan of Open Minds was actually on, and Jason, of course, espoused some more extraterrestrial-leaning theories. And again, you see, to me, this is interesting because what Jason said when he appeared on that program, a dear friend of mine who I'm in regular contact with, I may not agree with him on everything that he states publicly about UFOs, but does that mean that I have to ideologically reposition myself to be an enemy? No. That guy, I can tell you right now, I'll never be enemies with any of those people at Open Minds. They are like family to me, and we're all good friends. But what's beautiful is that there are some of us in this field who ask questions. We can have we don't differ that much. I make it sound almost in this example like Jason and I are like polar opposites. That's not the case. We agree on most things. But a good researcher, a grounded researcher, like he or I, could have differences in opinion on esoteric subjects, science, whatever, but still consider ourselves colleagues. And it's this cult of personality that there has to be this warring faction of skeptics fighting against the believers. I maintain that somewhere in between, Soraya, there are people like us who say, okay, we can question everything, and we can just simply resolve to say that in the absence of a complete data set that determines conclusively what is and what is not, that there is an element of truth that we can attain, but that we don't have the full story yet.
Well, I kind of feel like the truth is the truth. Whether or not, for instance, the UFO phenomena is a real phenomena or not, that's the case. And I'm fine with it either way, but from the evidence I've seen, there's something there. Now, I, like you, don't necessarily believe it's extraterrestrials, but to say there's nothing there at all is dismissing a lot of evidence.
It's also intellectually dishonest.
Yes.
It's funny because I see so many of the alleged skeptics these days talking about the intellectual dishonesty of UFO writers and researchers. Now, in fairness, this is a correct and an honest assertion in itself, because many writers do skew what they've written to favor their argument. But then again, by the same token, I look at someone like Philip J. Klass, who very suspiciously was able to come up with this argument against and was able to debunk every instance of alleged UFO activity ever that occurred. And I caught up with a protege of his in February, and I've probably talked to you about this before, Robert Schaefer.
I don't think so.
Okay, well, Robert Schaefer is a well-known and well-regarded critic of not just ufology. He's also been a critic of feminism. He's been a critic of a number of different things. But Schaefer is just a pariah in UFO circles, and unlike a lot of people in this field, He even attacked me on his blog. I gave my lecture, billed as the only skeptic at the 2013 UFO Congress. And again, that's almost a misappropriation of the word, because these people came into it expecting, oh, this is going to be the guy who's going to try and debunk everything. And I got up there on stage and I said, you cannot deny UFO phenomena and that there is something valid and physical behind this. And people were like, oh, okay. So this guy's a skeptic after all. And then I say, however, I have not been able to prove to my own satisfaction that there is an extraterrestrial component. Now let's define what extraterrestrial is, and let's look at how much evidence we can use to support an extraterrestrial hypothesis. Not one person shouted boo, hiss, shut up, get off the stage. A lot of people came up to me afterward and they said, you know, that's interesting. You really, what is your degree? What is your degree? Where did you go to school? Because you, and I said, I've got 2 years at a community college. I'm self-educated. I would love to, and this is in truth, if and when I have the time and the funds to do it, I would love to go back to school. Even if I have to do part of my training online, but I would love to go back to school and get a doctorate, you know, in physics or you know, astronomy or something like that would be relative to this field. And I actually hope to do that one day. To be able to apply real science to a subject, I don't think that you have to have a degree, but I think that for my own, you know, for my own person, having been self-educated for so long, I think that I would be able to go into proper academic schooling in this kind of a field without being so easily swayed or blinded by the persuasive elements in conventional you know, science and academia that so easily influence the younger college attendees and tend to kind of bring them into an ideological closed-mindedness. I think with a very open-minded worldview, I could go into the scientific study of space, chemistry, you know, physics, astronomy, all these things, cosmology, all, you know, and the potentials for extraterrestrial life, and be both unbiased and unhindered, but also accepting of what science can teach us about these things. But with or without a PhD or an MD, I still try to do those things, because you recognize that science is not, you know, what you have proven that you can do by virtue of going to a school. There are a lot of people, and people in the UFO community, who have obtained MDs and PhDs in their nutcases. I hate to say it, but it's true. You know, the measure of a man is not entirely based on the letters behind their name.
No, and I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, there's plenty of dumb people with PhDs and plenty of smart people without them.
And I've got some brilliant friends who do have PhDs, and they'll tell you the same thing. I mean, I've had them tell me, they're like, Micah, in America today, attaining, this is coming from people with PhDs. More than once I've been told, to obtain the PhD is more proof that you had the willingness to stick with it, and to obtain the PhD, it is not necessarily a measure of your intelligence or your ability. And this is coming from my friends in the academic circles, who are both skeptical, but also people who are open-minded enough to take interest in these subjects. And so, and it was such a compliment, because a friend of mine who is active in his participation in you know, the fields of both microbiology, but also certain aspects of ufology, he attended the Congress, and we didn't get to meet, and I regret that. Dr. Tyler Kochjohn, PhD of, I believe he's Arizona State, but Tyler Kochjohn had written on his personal blog, quote, Micah Hanks may be the future of ufology. And I've never been more humbled by a statement, because again, coming from a you know, a PhD professor, you know, and also a person who's a specialist in a field unrelated to ufology, but certainly probably related to the study of actual alien life, microbiology and the like. You know, it was such a humbling statement. He's not the only person who's ever come to me in a complimentary fashion from the academic community, but by the same token, enough about me, let's talk about you. By the same token, it's not about what a person does. My own convictions are that a person should be scientific, and that's why I bring this to the table.
Yeah.
Robert Schaefer is the gentleman that we were talking about, and after he witnessed my lecture, he basically said, you know, here's another glib speaker who gets up and uses science-y terminology and tries to evoke science in creating an argument for the existence of UFOs, and somehow also mysteriously ties Nazi technology into all this, in weaving a narrative that is still woefully unscientific. And so I went and I confronted him, but not in an angry way. I said, well, you know, I saw what you wrote on your blog, but I said, you know, we should compare notes in person, because I think you see me and you're sitting in the audience and you obviously have your mind made up. And I said, let's talk. Let's see where we really differ on a number of things. And we agreed on almost everything. Where we did not agree, And he ended up giving me his card afterwards and said, well, yeah, we need to stay in touch. didn't ever revoke what he said. He left everything up on his blog, and that's
Of
fine.
course not.
But he where we differed was that I had talked about the potential for military aircraft in conjunction with UFO sightings, and he kind of blurted out. He goes, "You believe that?" And I said, "Well, most certainly," because I said I don't think that the plethora, the incredible, the almost innumerable number of UFO reports can be explained by extraterrestrial civilizations, one or many, conducting a survey, an ongoing survey of planet Earth. I mean, again, if we want to refute an extraterrestrial hypothesis, it wouldn't take that much to conduct a cursory examination of planet Earth. Whatever this UFO component is incredibly well and deeply invested even in the ongoings and happenings of this planet. Now, what it is, I couldn't tell you, but it doesn't seem that if they are anything like human beings, these craft, that what they are doing technologically and scientifically would be conducive to a survey of the planet. They either are from here or they don't exist at all. And I said, I think that we can't rule out the existence of UFOs, and therefore I have to assume that the majority of these things are something that is from Earth itself. And therefore I have to question the military craft component and the like. And I said, and he said,
I would think that was a given, honestly.
well, of course, but then Schaefer, and again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to him. We just differed on this opinion, and as gentlemen, we disagreed. He said, well, I don't think that they're military craft, and the reason why is because if these things had been military craft, something that was seen by an alleged UFO encounterer or witness 30 years ago would have been declassified, and we'd known about these craft by now. And I said, so wait a minute. Well, so Bob, you mean to tell me? I mean, my jaw dropped, and I said this. I wish you could have been a fly on the wall and seen this. I said, so you mean to tell me that you think that beyond the potential for there being government craft, that there is some other explanation for the things that these people claim that they're seeing? And he said, absolutely. And I said, what? And he said, these people are lying. They're all liars. Now think about that for a minute. And I said, well, Bob, I said, you and I need to start a blog together, and we'll just call it The Lying Saucer. And he laughed. And he said, oh, brother, we'd both be sued. But that was that was maybe one of the most important conversations I've ever had, because that shows that there are people in this skeptical movement that are so cynical of perspectives towards UFOs. And even though he and I could agree on a lot of this, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that, well, people are just lying. I don't think people are just lying. And even Sharon Hill, again, one of the more popular and prevalent skeptics in this field right now, she wrote an editorial that appeared at the Huffington Post and said, who are we and how dare we tell these people that they did not have these experiences? Now, whether they imagined it all or they merely misinterpreted what they actually experienced, it's not our place to say that these people are liars. And I agree.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, so do I. And I mean, I think there is something genuine to the phenomenon that's an anomaly, that's an unknown. I would assume, especially nowadays, a lot of it is military craft. Mm-hmm. But it could be anything from natural formations of plasma and stuff, to intelligent forms of plasma, to time travelers, to visitors from another dimension, or even from another planet in some cases.
Oh, yeah.
But the fact is, we don't have any evidence to support any of it, really.
No, we don't. And funny couple of points there. A lot of people would think that intelligent plasma is a kooky concept, but let me just, I could even find it and show it to you. You may have already seen it. NASA has conducted or written documents supposing the potential for plasma life or life-like organisms to spring into existence and become autonomously controlled, if not aware, because I think that we could argue that there are simple life forms on planet Earth that are they may not be aware. They may not have awareness as in self-awareness, but that they nonetheless are alive and that they are functional and autonomous. And so NASA has examined and studied the potentiality for life-like instances of autonomy, I guess, to spring into existence in the vacuum of space, from perhaps plasma-like, I don't know what you'd call that, I guess, beings or configurations, because again, when we're talking about something that is life-like, something that has the hallmarks and the characteristics of life, autonomy, and order, and yet which is not the kind of life that we would expect to see cellular life on planet Earth. I mean, it's a very strange concept, but again, in exploring the possibilities and the potentials there have been academic papers that have been written about these quote-unquote kooky ideas. The other thing I want to point out, too, is that at Paradigm Symposium, being the arch skeptic that he is, even P.Z. Myers, in response to a question that a young man, actually a good friend of mine named Graham Dunlop, asked from the audience. I say young man, but he's older than me, but then again, I guess I'm an old soul. Graham had asked why people in the skeptic movement can't be more accepting of the idea that there are phenomena and that the UFO phenomena may actually be represented by a physical phenomenon. And P.Z. Myers' response was simply this: and who's to say that we don't? And who's to say that, there isn't some phenomena? I mean, obviously, I think even were his words, obviously there's some phenomena, but this could be a number of things ranging from military craft to anomalous natural phenomenon. It didn't have to be aliens. And I said, I agree with that statement. And then we moved on. And after that lecture, or it wasn't a lecture, it was actually a Q&A with the audience, I approached PZ afterward and I said, great statement you made on UFOs. And he looks at me, smirks, and goes, well, if you say so, since you say that we agree.
Wow.
How many different ways can I tell you that we agree? I completely agree with everything you just said. If you say so. It's just like, okay, well, fine then. We don't agree. If you say so, PZ.
Well, look also at how, Jacques Vallee got into all of this.
Oh, yeah.
He saw a UFO. He became an astronomer thinking, well, this is how you study UFOs, naively. And then found out, oh yeah, they're tracking UFOs and they don't know what they are, so they just destroy the tapes.
They ditch the tapes. That was such an incredible, revelatory story even. Yeah. And you know why I think that they would ditch those tapes? Because, okay, we observe something that we can't account for. What are we supposed to do? Keep a running file on anomalies? Keep a running file on things that we can't explain? Let's save the great big pot of soup that burned when we left it on the burner for too long. No, you're going to throw that out. It's unusable, right? I think that truly at times there are scientific agencies that when they come across unusable data or what they perceive as such, better to toss out the burned victuals than to keep them in the fridge.
Well, I think in his journals he said he pursued it a little bit to find out why they would discard these, yeah. And they were told that they didn't want to be the laughing stock to come out and say that they had tracked a UFO. They said if the United States comes out, because he was in France, they said if the United States comes out and says that they're tracking UFOs, then they'll start presenting their data. But until that happens, they're not going to get laughed at by the world for saying that UFOs exist.
Yeah. And meanwhile, rather than being a global conspiracy to cover up UFOs, I bet you, around the same time, intelligence agencies in the United States were probably doing the exact same thing.
Yeah. And then, there's also, I don't know, have you ever read his Forbidden Science, his journals?
Is that the one that was co-authored with...
No, it's Vallee's actual journal entries from, 1960 on.
I haven't. No, I mean, having read a lot of his books, I haven't read that one.
They're very interesting. And one of the things he talks about is at one point, he talks a lot about Project Blue Book and how that was just a fiasco. Yeah. But he also talks about contacting Carl Sagan.
Really?
And he says that Sagan was interested in UFOs, but was dismissive of them. And he had asked Sagan, if I collect the 10 best cases that I have, would you be willing to take an honest scientific look at them? And Sagan said, yes, I'll do that for you. So he took all this time and he weeded through all his cases and came up with the most scientifically backed, the cases that had the best evidence, so on and so forth, went to present them to Sagan. He said, I don't have time for this. I don't want to see them.
Really?
And it upset him to no end because he thought, well, here's an inroad with a respected scientist who's willing to take a look at the actual data, and then he just blew him off.
That is so... God, you see, Sagan is someone who I own, a lot of Sagan's work. I mean, I've got... let's just say as a scientific thinker, I admire Sagan a lot, the late Sagan, of course. But, that's so troubling when let me tell you what I interpret that is. And again, in order not to sound subjective, because what I'm offering is entirely a subjective perspective, but the way I interpret what Sagan is saying in that instance, what I interpret that as being is a person who is truly beholden to a worldview and a set of standards by which they are comfortable operating within our consensus reality, or the perception of that consensus reality. And of course, if you know me, I always argue that if you want simple proof that there are limitations to what perception can tell us through our senses, what sensory perception of our environment can tell us, despite the fact that that there are scientific ways that we can, reach beyond the innate sensory limitations of humankind. Despite that, what we have to keep in mind is that if you look at, for instance, a dog or a cat, and you recognize that their ability to perceive infrared and to be able to literally walk into a dark room and still be able to see, whereas a human being can't, what you realize is that there are certainly limitations, or rather than limitations, differences in perceptibility, perhaps from human to human and certainly from species to species. I've often postulated, especially in a cosmological sense, if alien beings were to evolve on another planet based on how life evolves elsewhere in the different parts of our what we could perceive as being and imagine being the universe, depending on how alien life might evolve, I wonder if our dominant sense here on planet Earth, vision, might not be the dominant sense on another planet.
Sure.
If for instance on another planet, this planet is close enough to a sun that it orbits, that life is able to come into existence on this planet, but perhaps because of planetary changes and of course environmental changes as a result of the passage of time, what if life on this planet at one time had been human-like, but as a result of proximity to its sun, this planet became warmer and warmer and warmer within a certain area of degrees that in essence life could still exist, but it had to alter the way it existed. And so let's presume that our Earth-like beings, our human-like beings even, go underground so as to escape the direct heat and influence of the nearest sun. And so they go underground and they are able to successfully exist underground, but they evolve. They continue to evolve. Let's say that this process continues for thousands of years, and Earth-like, human-like beings, in order to continue to exist, evolve to exist in an environment completely unlike humans, i.e. a terrestrial existence above ground. They evolve to exist underground. What kinds of sensory capabilities might beings like humans that exist underground, what might they develop? And so the thing is that we have to take perception and sensory capabilities into consideration, knowing that there's a pretty wide. I think all basic animal forms on planet Earth have very similar sensory capabilities, but to what degree they are used and the differences between them are pretty great relative to life on planet Earth.
Right, and who's to say how life is going to develop on a completely different planet? Scientists will say there's no life elsewhere in our solar system, but how do we know something hasn't developed in the depths of Jupiter or Saturn that is so unlike what we're used to perceiving as life that we wouldn't even recognize it?
Exactly. It may be life not as we know it. And then bringing that back around to science and perception, and Carl Sagan specifically, when we recognize that the senses are fallible, even if we have scientific technology that can allow us to perceive more than what our senses, and not just the five senses. There are dozens of senses, but ranging from pressure, heat and cold, all these different kinds of things. But the important thing too to keep in mind is that knowing that there are limitations and that there could be variances in the way that humans perceive things versus other beings, and then of course the way that those variances in perception might even misconstrue or perceive data that is scientifically attainable differently from others, and how we may even change the way that we perceive data on down the road. At the end of the day, all information that can be attained still must be filtered through the senses, and we can apply so much logic to it but still may not have a complete picture. Inevitably, the way that the brain has evolved to function causes us to gravitate toward ideas that we over time, through experiential processes, i.e. living, we inevitably begin to take certain information and we begin to collect it and compile it into areas of comfort zones, proverbial comfort zones, if you will. And it's so clear to me when we have people like Carl Sagan come forward and say, well, thank you for taking time to compile data which is going to directly challenge and potentially conflict with my worldview, and therefore I'm going to have to dismiss you outright. I have not got time for this absurdity. No one in the scientific establishment during Sagan's lifetime probably could have brought better information of a valid nature, of a scientific nature, regarding supposed UFO incidents and contact and the like, than Jacques Vallee. And to be dismissive of a person like Jacques Vallee, who of course is, unlike Grant Hancock, has still been welcomed into the fold with the TEDx group and everything, and been allowed to give his presentations and the like, who is still respected not only as a UFO researcher, but as a computer scientist, as an entrepreneur, as a business advisor in Silicon Valley. You know, this is obviously a legitimate individual with obviously scientific ability to discern and collect and gather data and interpret that data. And I'm appalled that someone who I respect as much as the late Carl Sagan would have treated him that way.
The thing I also didn't know about Vallee is that, I mean, he's basically was the guy who came up with some of the ideas behind search engines that we use today.
Yeah. I think some of the earlier implemented wide area networks and things along those lines in the Silicon Valley area. I mean, really the precursors to the internet, the modern interwebs. You know, Al Gore and the like may say that they've created the internet, but Vallee actually had a hand in that.
Well, this was back in the '60s, and he was working for these astronomical places that were cataloging different stars and stuff like that, and they would do search engines that you had to put in specific data in order to find it. And he said, you know, I can get this so you can put in words.
Yeah.
And they told him, you can't do that. That's impossible. And he's like, no, I'm pretty sure I can do it. And one of the companies he was working for wouldn't even let him try. The next company he went to let him try, and he was able to do it. And I mean, that, as far as I'm concerned, that's the furthest back precursor of things like Google as you're going to get.
Yeah, and look at this again. A man who believed in the potential, not in what we perceive as the present limitations that science imposes against us. You know, as soon as we accept that what we can understand scientifically and the impositions that we perceive thereof are as far as we can go, that will be the limit of our progression as a civilization. People like Vallee are the forward thinkers that we need, and who have been, I think that constitutes what I would call empirical evidence, not just of his ability and his achievements. I think that is empirical evidence that we can apply to the perception of where we're going scientifically. People like Vallee talk about things that often are criticized in scientific circles, such as technological singularity, and of course this is a subject I've written a lot about. I authored a book with that unfortunately, I'll just leave it at that. I've authored one book that features that unfortunate word in the title, and I call singularity an unfortunate term because it has become, as much as UFO or anything else, one of those terms that is labeled for criticism. Jason Colavito, a skeptical blogger, referred to the UFO singularity as a book about made-up ideas, including how UFOs are going to reveal the singularity to us in the future. I simply state this, and I pose this to Mr. Colavito. Read the book, because I know you haven't, and I know you won't. Because if you read the book, you would not have made such a blatant and obvious mistake in the way that he defined what the book was about. Furthermore, my readers corrected him on this statement, and he corrected it and did not note on his blog the fact that he had corrected it. And so again, my readers, no one attacks him. No one from, it's not like I've got these sycophants that follow me or something like that. These are friends and fellow researchers, colleagues, but they brought to my attention, and they showed me the before and the after, and it was obvious that he had changed what he had written to make it look like he got it right the first time, when he had blatantly misspoken about what my book was even about. And then at the end, he ended up finally coming back around and claiming that, well, now we all agree and we can all live happily ever after. He criticizes me for being a person who writes speculative works regarding the connection, potentially, that I see between not alien spaceships, but between unidentified flying objects and what futurists of today call technological singularity. He calls himself, however, an exo. What's the term that he actually uses for it? I think it's like a speculative exo. What's the term? Basically, a person who studies the potential that life, exists on other planets and things like this.
Exobiologist.
Yeah, like something. There's a term that he uses on his site. I should actually pull it up so that I don't misspeak, because I don't want to do that. But it's interesting because I looked at the actual title of that he applies to himself, and I'm thinking about it saying, well, look at that. I mean, how is a person an expert on planetary life that exists elsewhere in the universe? Has he been to another planet? Has he examined life on another planet? He calls what I do. Let's see here. I've got his site pulled up here, and he's a really intelligent guy, by the way. I think I admire Jason's work a lot, and I've enjoyed his writing in the past. He calls himself a xenoarchaeologist. There we go. The skeptical xenoarchaeologist. But again, if we were to break this term down, he does so for us on his site. Greek xeno meaning foreign or alien, and then of course archaeology being the science of archaeology, or of course the study of ancient potentialities, possibilities, and the like. How are you a skeptical xenoarchaeologist? How are you a xenoarchaeologist of any kind? If you've been to another planet, if you haven't studied an alien species, we can speculate about them. So what does that mean? That xenoarchaeology would have to be an inherently speculative science? And I'm sure he would probably try and debate this. But the thing is that at the end of the day, much of what science constitutes is inherently and must be speculative, because we have to suppose certain things based on apparent correlations and patterns that we are able to perceive, even in the absence of evidence, because without doing so, we can't even begin to guess where to make the next leap.
Yeah.
This is, I think, the very reason why Carl Sagan referred to science as a candle in the dark. The light that is cast from the candle only irradiates so far. There's a lot of darkness. In order to be able to see beyond that darkness, we have to sometimes guess where the path will lead, in the absence of being able to see where it's actually going. And so it's a shame to me that people, in the absence of having read my book, for instance, would say, this guy's, he's writing about made-up ideas and things. Well, read the book. I've read your blog. I've read your articles and seen what you've had to say, and I don't disagree with much. But by the same token, I think that it's not only an ignorant statement to say something about someone whose work you've never read or familiarized yourself with, and by the same token, call yourself something which is inherently contradictory unless you accept that you too are a speculative philosopher.
I also found it, when we were talking about the perceptions and stuff, John Keel's Eighth Tower deals a lot with how UFOs tend to move in from the infrared. People will see them come in from infrared colors and disappear into infrared colors. And just other realms of perception that are a little bit beyond what we normally perceive, but like elf waves that might have effects on us, and so on and so forth. And this suggested to him that this is one of his arguments, that they were interdimensional. They were coming from a level of reality that we simply don't perceive.
I've always been interested by that, and I feel like at this point, I can safely say at this point in the conversation, I've been running my mouth more than I should, because I know these podcasts, the midweek podcasts that you do, Soraya, are more kind of like, more like a conversation. So I want to exchange roles and pose a question to you.
Okay.
John Keel, on the whole, what do you think about John Keel as a researcher? Because we've been running the gamut here and talking about everyone from Carl Sagan to Jacques Vallee, Jason Colavito, all three people I really respect. I agree with them all, but when it comes to John Keel, your perception on John Keel?
I absolutely love Keel's work, but I'm fully aware that he was also a storyteller. So I think whereas you could say most of his stuff was probably genuine research and he was reporting it honestly, I do think here and there he may have taken liberties. And I know there's at least one case, I don't remember which book it was in, that he found out before the book went to press that the information was wrong, but didn't bother to correct it. I think, however, he is an astute observer of human nature. His observations are generally poignant and often funny, just out and out hilarious at times.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that about the correction to his book. I should actually state, by the way, there's a book that's on its way to you right now called The Ghost Rockets that I wrote. And a friend of mine with an engineering background sent along a couple of corrections, including at one point I gave the impression that there was a helicopter descending in altitude 2,000 miles per hour, which really I think physically would have destroyed the helicopter. Certainly I didn't mean to write that, but the way that it was worded, it seems to have gives that impression, and he corrected that and said it was actually 2,000 feet per second, which would have been approximately 23 miles per hour, which was not really a great, tremendous rate of descent. And so, I hope that's one of the beautiful things about self-publishing. Having self-published this book and having been corrected on that technical detail by a person with an engineering background in aerospace science, I can correct that and acknowledge publicly, as I'm doing right now, that mistake exists. And again, having tried to write a book that is more technical, I think of the last 3 interviews I've done that talked about ghost rockets, this not really being one of them, but mentioning it nonetheless, I've tried to bring that up so that people who read the book, with or without a background in aviation and aerospace and science and physics, will see that and remember that I said I misspoke and that needs to be corrected.
And it happens. It happens to everyone. Everyone's going to either miswrite something or misinterpret something or write it in a way that is going to be misinterpreted.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
but it's one thing. It's a different thing, though, when you know it's wrong and you just go, well, I'm just going to leave it there. I guess whatever was wrong actually supported whatever point he was making in the chapter, so he really didn't want to remove it.
Yeah, unfortunately, and again, being a fellow admirer of Keel's writing and research, to the extent that my friends at Fate Magazine have asked me to include a column. It's funny because again, I've come to a position in my life where I feel like I'm more of a skeptic, and Phyllis Galdi at Fate is a wonderful person and a good friend. Again, you don't have to agree with a person's worldview entirely to be able to say, you know what, we're good friends and we can work together.
Sure.
Fate Magazine launched my career as a writer. My first article ever in print was in Fate Magazine about a decade ago. And as a side note, P.Z. Myers mentioned more than once that he used to be a prolific reader of Fate Magazine in his youth.
Well, I'll tell you what, Fate Magazine damn near saved my life, but that's a long story for another time.
Oh, wow. Well, when I have you on my show soon, I want to hear that story. So.
All right.
But and before we finish up this conversation, off the air, let's get that hammered out too. By the way, but Fate Magazine, it's funny because they launched my career, and then years later, it's funny that they've come back around. And I always used to read Mark Chorvinsky's column, Lauren Coleman's column. Lauren, of course, being one of the people who was most formative, probably to my own writing style. Someone I've always admired. Someone I'm still pleased to be able to say is a good friend, and I have unending respect. Again, Lauren Coleman being one of those unique people who's open-minded but skeptical, and if he sees skeptical, he'll say that's bullcrap, and he'll call something that's bullcrap when he feels that there's a need to be skeptical. As a matter of fact, I think Joe Nickel and Benjamin Radford have written a new book on sea monsters, and Lauren Coleman wrote the foreword for the book. Anyone who wants to say that Lauren Coleman is a hopeful dreamer, who just wants to believe, he's a person who has been more than comfortable straddling that fence and walking on either side when he has to, when the facts, require it.
Right.
That is something I've always respected about him. But it's funny because I grew up reading his columns in Fate. Mark Chorvinsky, Antonio Huneus, who's become a good friend. He now works for Open Minds. And I was recently asked to write a column for Fate, and what they want to call it is Beyond the Known, which is a direct reference to Keel. And the reason why is because Phyllis said, having known Keel when he was alive, she said, you remind me, Micah Hanks, more of Keel than anyone, who I've met since he died. And
that's awesome.
It was awesome. I was humbled by that. And by the same token, I think that Keel was, a writer, a skeptic.
He was. He was very much a skeptic.
He was human, and sure, I don't think that it's intellectually honest to leave information in a book if you know that it's wrong. But by the same token, he was a human being, and I've seen skeptics do the same thing, like Carl Sagan did when approached by Jacques Vallee. And what that shows, unfortunately, is that without demonizing Keel or Sagan, what that shows is that there is an ideological component to all this, and that people want to stay within the realm of what their accepted belief is comfortable with, accepting, and they don't want to have to bring into the fold, so to speak, those things which lie outside that circle of acceptance. And
when you read,
sorry, go ahead.
When you read Keel's first book, Jado,
yes,
or Jadu, whatever he, it's written from such a skeptical perspective, but. I'm reading it and I'm thinking there's definitely a little bit of storytelling in here. It's a fun read. It's like reading an adventure story.
It's a good book, though, isn't it?
It's a very good book.
Anomalous books, that's something I love about them. Speaking of, funny enough, I met, I I think I met Patrick Weege for the first time the same weekend I met Lauren Coleman years and years ago at a conference that was held here in Asheville, North Carolina. Patrick Weege, of course, being the man behind Anomalous Books, and he's been a friend for years. And I've always reviewed books for them, and God, they, for a small a small publishing company, they put out so many good books. They reissued a book by, it's one of the only significantly influential books on psychic phenomenon that I've ever read, which was written by a man named Robert Cracknell, who had been a British psychic detective for a number of years. His heyday was in the 1980s. I reviewed the book, which led to the producer of my program at the time contacting Robert Cracknell. He's still alive, and he lives in Cyprus. And Bob and I ended up becoming dear friends, and we're still in touch to this day. And I tell you what an incredibly wonderful, wonderful human being he is. But this book was called The Lonely Sense, and I recommend it to anyone. If you want to get an interesting perspective on psychic phenomenon, read Robert Cracknell's The Lonely Sense. Anomalous Books, I reprinted that. They've done a lot of, they don't just do reprints, but that's what's important, is that in this field today, I think, so that these old books that dealt with this phenomenon several years ago, which really kind of laid the groundwork for how these people will approach these things today and continue to. Anomalous Books has made sure that everything from Vallee's Alien Contact trilogy, they've made sure that all these kinds of things have remained publicly available and have remained in print, as well as new offerings like Lyle Blackburn's new book. Lyle Blackburn, cryptozoologist who wrote a book.
Yeah, we're going to have him on here probably in the next month or so.
Excellent. What's funny,
for his new book,
I met him. I've always been fascinated with the story of the Falcon Monster. And I met Lyle. I had him on the show right after the book came out. Anomalous Books sent me that book to look at, and the day it arrived, I contacted him. I think it was on Monday, and I said, I'm doing a show on Tuesday nights called The Gralien Report, which I still do. It's a podcast like this program. And I said, Lyle, can you join me on the program? No, it came in the mail on Tuesday. That's right, because I said, can you come on the show tonight? And he says, I might have to rearrange my schedule. Let me see what I can do. And he emails me right back and says I can do it. Got him on the show that day. Didn't even read the book, because, I'm very aware of the story of the Falcon Monster. I read the book after the fact, but, I had to get him on the show right away. I was so impressed with the layout, the design, what he was talking about, and I said, I just got to get him on here. So we had him on the program, and Lyle and I struck up a friendship, and we finally got to meet in Sacramento last summer.
Awesome.
And I told him, I said, man, that book you wrote on the Falcon Monster is so great. And I tell you, I've got a sequel for you. You need to go to South Carolina. You live in Texas. You could drive, probably within a day, get up to South Carolina, and you need to write a book about the Lizard Man of Bishopville. Whether or not you want to really believe that there was a creature that was a reptilian-human hybrid, I don't believe that. I believe that there was something going on. And whether you want to believe it is entirely a folk tale, or whether you want to perceive that as being a literal instance of a cryptozoological beast of some sort, the Bishopville Lizard Man is a fascinating story, as is the story of the Falcon Monster. And again, I think most people would call Lyle Blackburn a cryptozoologist. I call him both that and also a folklorist. He's written for Morgue magazine, and he's very involved in the horror film culture and everything. And there's a culture around that. There's a folklore to that, Frankenstein, Dracula, mummies, monsters, And this is what draws him to the more real-life counterparts, or the allegations thereof. And so I told him, I said, you should look into the Lizard Man thing. And it wasn't 2 months, he emails me and says, Mike, I went to Bishopville, and I talked with Liston Truesdale, the former sheriff, and he says, you're right, I think there's something to this. I'm going to write this book. And I was so happy because, that book needed to be written, and Lyle was the guy to do it. And I have that book now, and I haven't read it yet, but I did have a chance to look over The Galley. I've probably read 4 or 5 chapters, and it's an incredible book, and Lyle is an incredible writer, and I'm so glad there's somebody like him, a guy who's probably not much older than me, who's in that field, who's the crypto thing, because again, it's funny. Somebody asked me recently, Sarai, and I wonder this myself. Are these subjects losing their appeal to young researchers who think that what the research and the writing is what they see on programs on primetime television?
Right.
I don't think that's what it is, and that's certainly not what John Keel and Jacques Vallee and Ivan Sanderson, and John Napier, to name a more skeptical cryptozoological writer of years past, who was with the Smithsonian Institute. I don't think that that's what these people were doing. What we see on these television programs is not the kind of research that's really going to move the field forward, and I worry sometimes that younger researchers are going to maintain involvement in investigative processes, whether that be journalistic or scientific or otherwise.
Well, a lot of the TV shows, I mean, like any reality show, it has to be, what did they say? People like to watch people running around in the dark on night vision. And that's what most of them are. And for some reason, it is slightly entertaining, I have to admit.
Oh, it's entertaining, but see, that's the distinction.
It's not, yeah.
The distinction has to be made between what is, well, first of all, I mean, science is different from, you can be a great writer and you can be a crackshot journalist, but someone who writes about essentially folklore, folk tales, mythology, and things like that. Then you can be a scientist who says, well, I seek to actually try and, whether or not I'm trying to lend any legitimacy to the idea that Bigfoot or a creature like that could exist, I'm going to try and apply a scientific approach to the study of this potential, And then there's the person who says, I don't care if it's well written, I don't care if there is any science behind it, what will make this entertaining and draw up the ratings? What will make this a profitable endeavor? And that's the threefold approach, but there are probably others if we wanted to really get into, what else can be lent to and what other approaches can be applied to this field of study, Fortiana, for lack of a better term. And, they're all quite different from one another.
I tend to believe that when you're looking at some of these monster encounters, when you're looking at a lot of this Fortiana, a lot of paranormal stuff, that it's probably an emanation of the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
That it's our brains putting a face on something that we have no way of understanding in its actual form. Because everything we see because it contrasts with something. Mm-hmm. So if there was only red, we wouldn't see colors because we need blue or black or something to contrast it to. Mm-hmm. And I think these things are in our reality in a way that we can't. It has no contrast. It has nothing. So our brains perceive there's something there and puts a face on it. And once that face is there, someone says, I saw this, then the next person that encounters it also sees that.
Right.
And it may be very, very far away from what it actually is.
So think of it like this. A light is seen in the sky. The first person who sees it says, I see something in the sky. They describe it to a friend. What was it? Well, it was an object. The friend happens to be a scientist, and they say, well, it could have been this, this, or this, or this. But to be fair, we'll call it, let's use the term that's been employed since the 1950s, first instituted under the oversight of Edward Ruppelt, who was the first project leader for the Project Blue Book with the U.S. Air Force. I mean, he coined that term, unidentified flying object. So let's say we're dealing with an unidentified flying object, and then another person sees an unidentified flying object, UFO, and they say, my God, that thing just was unlike anything I've ever seen in this world. Do you think it could have been alien? Maybe it was. Well, that was a spaceship. The next person sees a UFO, and they say, I saw a UFO. But two people who hear them say that say this person claims they saw a spaceship. There's this evolution that can be applied to perception, terminology that is applied to the physical phenomena being observed. There's an incredible work that was referred to me by a colleague years and years ago called, well, not years and years ago, but at least a couple of years ago, about Ernst Cassirer, a German philosopher, called Language and Myth, and it looks at the parallels between the utilization of language relative to symbology and myths, or ideas and concepts that surround symbological usage of language and terminology. A physical scientist might have little or no interest in something like that, but a philosopher is going to be profoundly interested in the fact that the way that we utilize certain terms in reference to physical phenomena that are observed. It's interesting because there is a process within the brain that serves as a middleman between the usage of a symbol, which essentially a word is. Language itself is a symbolic interpretation of physical phenomena occurring around a physical being. And when we stop to think about language on those terms and we compare that with the physicality of the world around us, it becomes almost mind-numbing when we begin to realize how easily we influence one another utilizing language that from person to person we may not fully understand. That language and the symbolism inherent to that language can differ conceptually from human to human. And it's a fascinating but a very deep and a very murky subject to try and get into, because I think that what we can all probably agree on is that the physicality around us that we observe as humans or anything else, that is constant. What is not constant is the ability to perceive in the brain what is being observed. And then when we try and speak about that, we utilize language, whether written or spoken, which is an act of symbolizing and externalizing what has been perceived. The best that can be conveyed to another individual nearby is a representation of the physical phenomena observed, which is always going to be subjective. And again, the scientists who say that, I'm sorry, this is the science and that's the hard reality and this is what we know 100%, and if anyone thinks that there's anything beyond that or apart from that, they are wrong. I don't agree with that, because again, it comes down to inevitability involved within the subjective nature of trying to define, communicate, and perceive. Perception is inherently limited, and through the limitations of perception, we have to determine within the mind whatever we are perceiving physically occurring around us. Then we utilize a symbological process of appending language to that, which we convey to a person. Something interesting, by the way, and I'll give you an example. When I dug into the writings of Carl Jung, there were a couple of instances where he talked about, some of his patients describing that they would wake up in the middle of the night and that they would see these grotesque-looking goblins standing around their bed. I was fascinated by this because I found this to be a potential parallel to modern reports of alien abduction, where they have encounters with bedroom visitors and things like this, right? And so looking into it, within the course of a single English language translation of an essay by Jung, these entities are referred to variously as grotesque goblins or kobolds or something else. And I thought it would be interesting to go back to the German language and see what in the German language this had initially been represented as. What had been, or had there been, a singular term that Jung actually applied in reference to these bedroom encounters? And furthermore, what we would call an alien being today in a popular abduction scenario, would that be one variant on a constantly perceived phenomenon that has been with us for much longer, that Jung even wrote about long before the concept of alien abduction was even prevalent in our mass consciousness, as a meme, if you will.
Right.
It's interesting to think about.
Oh, absolutely. And Jung had his own theories on the UFO phenomenon.
Well, what's interesting about that is that it's often asserted that Jung had appended to the UFO phenomenon this idea that it was inescapably psychological, and that we were, the fact that these saucers were round in shape was, I think he said that the round shape, or that the geometric propensities, that seem to emanate from the alleged saucer appearances, keeping in mind that a flying saucer could be everything from a triangle to an aircraft-shaped thing. I mean,
right.
Flying saucer was a misnomer to the nth degree, but I digress. He did often say that the circular formation, keeping in mind that some saucer reports actually involve what are described as actual saucer-shaped craft, was relative to something symbological. He thought that there was an externalization of war nerves and people's concern over the constant threat, the push and pull between the Western and the Eastern superpowers emerging after the Second World War. But in private correspondence, Jung also was known to have acknowledged that there was an inescapable physical reality to some of these reports because of the fact that they've been traced and tracked on radar.
Yeah. And he also would go out in the garden and talk to his own personal daemon.
He did that. He claimed when he was a young man that he had seen a not a headless, but he said that he saw a greenish apparition with the head removed, floating in front of the body, emerging from his mother's chamber, walking down the hallway in front of it. He, when he was a young man, had a ritual that he would carry out. He wasn't a young man; he was a child. He would go up into his attic of his house, and he'd carved a little totem, a face or something, into a wooden stick that he kept inside of a little box, and he communicated with it by writing it letters in a language that only he understood. Jung also induced hallucinations in his study, in his middle life, because of what he described as a violent confrontation with his unconscious that he had had. This led to the authoring of his Red Book, probably the most controversial but also beautiful of his workings, which led to his idea, his theories about there being, if anything, autonomous elements within the human collective unconscious. These archetypes, of course, which is the popular terminology that's used for these things. Jung had he coined the term synchronicity, and he actually claimed that in his own experiences with synchronicities, at one point he was having a heated argument with his colleague Sigmund Freud, and at one point he had alleged that while he was talking with Freud that he had gotten very heated, and he had explained to Freud that these synchronicities were real, and this chest of drawers next to him pops really loudly. And Freud looks over and says, "What was that? Did you do that?" He said, "Yes, and I'll do it again." And as Jung says, this thing goes pop, and it pops again very loudly. And so, Jung noted in his writings, which I've read a good bit, a number of these sorts of instances, synchronicities, which my friends today in modern philosophy and especially in academia, physicists and the like, they don't discount the synchronistic component. They rather look at it as coming back to something Vallee's talked about, what we've discussed here. The idea that there are elements of our physicality and the reality around us that function sort of like a search engine. And that if you put certain information or ideas out to the world around you, there's a certain potential for the universe to, for lack of a better term, to send you information back.
Great.
That there is kind of an exchange, an informational exchange ongoing between, and whether or not you want to say that a person says, "Hey, I'd like to see a UFO," and one appears or not. I've tried that many times. It's never worked for me, but I've heard people in literature have said that it's happened.
Yep.
Whether or not you want to assert that there's a direct exchange of that variety going on, you can't deny the fact that, our interaction with our environment as humans is an informational exchange, an ongoing informational exchange that begins at the time of birth and ends at the time of death, or maybe carries on beyond those jurisdictions even. Which is a really esoteric concept. But what is the physicist? He's made headlines recently for saying that he believes that death is a perceptual illusion, and that quantum physics proves this. And I think to an extent that is a justifiable statement, in the sense that philosophically we can try and understand this. Scientifically it's much more difficult to try and conceptualize, but the idea that beginning and end are universal constants is something that is largely perceptual and illusory in a perceptual capacity, because of the way that we as humans have evolved to exist and to interact with our environments. The way that we perceive and the way that we remember things going on around us in the same order in which entropy increases, as Stephen Hawking has written about, which is, again, a really complex subject. But I think that in truth, a lot of the things that we perceive as constants around us are primarily illusory, and that in truth, this informational exchange I'm talking about may even exceed the boundaries that we perceive as being life and death.
Yeah, absolutely. When we were talking about lights too, when you mentioned someone sees a light in the sky and they say, well, if nothing else, it's an unidentified flying object.
Yeah.
When you see the same light in a haunted house, suddenly it's a ghost.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the right thing. In other words, which comes back to something interesting you were alluding to earlier, is that you wonder sometimes if, to use a blanket term, Fortiana in this instance, you begin to wonder if at times, the different genres are breaking apart the same phenomenon and interpreting them differently relative to worldview, culture, and predisposed opinions, belief-oriented viewpoints toward this alleged phenomena, for lack of a better term.
We're seeing different perspectives of one larger part of reality that we don't normally perceive.
Exactly, different perspectives. From one angle, a geometric shape, a three-dimensional shape might appear to be a square, and yet from another angle, when only viewed partially, it could appear to be, rhombus. It could be, more triangular or pyramidal, if we're going to be truly three-dimensional here. So,
and if we go back to John Keel for a second, he always talked about these interdimensional beings. That he thought they came from an added dimension that we don't perceive, and he would compare it to living in a two-dimensional world, where if a three-dimensional finger put itself down in your two-dimensional world, you wouldn't see it coming. It would just suddenly be there. You would have no idea what it was or where it came from, and then when the finger was lifted up, it would just be gone. You wouldn't see that third dimension of movement.
Right. Yeah. That which is funny, because that's a similar. Well, it's not similar. It's identical to the argument that was espoused by who? Now the author. I forget the author of the Flatland.
Oh, yeah.
But later in the 1980s, I suppose, Carl Sagan employed that same argument in trying to understand dimensions, and then he, of course, discussed a tesseract and things like that. And it's interesting that you see, scientists and, of course, the fringe theorists, employing the same terminology to try and distinguish between, well, actually, really, what is different about Carl Sagan using that terminology to discuss dimensions and John Keel doing the same thing? That's what's really funny about it.
Yeah.
These are two men who were believed to have been fundamentally different in their worldview, and yet they're both discussing the same thing and employing the same language, the same, the same, not acronym, but I mean the same
example.
Yeah, the same example essentially, for doing so. I mean, people are more often on the same page, and yet again, I have to assert that there's an ideological perspective that inhibits people, from separate worldviews from being able to communicate and effectively. Now, by the same token, it should be also asserted that there's also a breakdown in an ability to converse scientifically. But I mean, think about this. Aside from maybe science writers or someone who holds maybe a bachelor's degree or better in science, who goes to write, on science for, anything from the New York Times to a more science-oriented popular magazine like Popular Mechanics or Discover Magazine or something like that, there can still be a breakdown between a journalist, who is a person who collects facts and then writes about this, and a scientist, a person who implies or employs scientific language. And I think that, again, that's a simple, where you don't have to have a person who believes in Bigfoot versus a person who is an art skeptic and an evolutionary biologist. You can simply have a person who's a journalist, who's a political or a current events writer, or gossip writer for that matter, versus a person who studies quantum physics. Those two people might be able to meet on the street, They might resolve to become friends and sit down and want to have coffee, but they may not be able to employ a language that, relative to their experiential backgrounds, their lifestyles, their interests, that they're able to employ and effectively communicate. Now, sometimes friendship and strange, relationships that we as humans hold with one another can traverse those boundaries, those cultural boundaries. But more often than not, what I tend to find is that, again, I use the example of the great big island of condoms floating out in the South Pacific. Do you know this story?
No.
Yeah, it's a story about the strange propensity for condoms that get lost at sea to tend to gravitate toward one another because they are of like mass. I don't know how much of this is actually true, but the story goes that there's supposedly a huge mass of rubber, a lot of it condoms, and then a lot of it cellophane and things like that, rubber and plastic debris of similar constitution that is gathered together in this great big pile of junk floating out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, maybe I have heard about this. Yeah,
and because where the story comes from and the cause behind it is allegedly that items of similar shape, constitution, physicality, mass, whatnot, floating out there in the buoyancy of the ocean tend to eventually collect together over time. I think that humans are very much the same way. We're all condoms floating in a sea of salt water. Think about it. We all tend to gravitate toward those things which are similar to us and those people who think very much like we do. And that's just the sad truth. And if we could challenge ourselves by saying, okay, you might be a Satanist and I'm, a cardinal to the Holy Church of Rome. You might be a praying mantis and I'm a butterfly. You might be a person who likes Indian food and I'm a fan of hamburgers and American fare. We might have differences in our opinions, beliefs, attitudes, and the things that subjectively appeal to us, but we can learn from one another by challenging our comfort area and allowing people into our bubble from time to time, from whom we may learn and get a little bit of cultural perspective. If more people would do that, we'd have a lot less that we disagree on.
Well, I think we learn a lot more from the people who have that other experience than the people we agree with. It may feel comfortable to talk to someone who, you click with and you agree with on everything, but you don't grow from that as much.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the whole thing. That's why I've learned over time to welcome differing opinions and
absolutely
separate worldviews into my reality, because what it offers me is the ability to grow as an individual. And I'll tell you, Soraya, not just from writing and studying stuff, but from talking, with people like you and, a lot of my friends in the field, Scotty Roberts, John Ward, Nick Redfern, Chris O'Brien, and people like this. I've come to, I'm a different person today than the person I was 10 years ago. My worldview my attitudes. I'm a different person. I'm a different person. But
and hopefully 10 years from now you'll be yet another different person.
I hope so. I truly hope so.
While still being you.
Kind of like Doctor Who, It's like after a few years we have to regenerate and become someone different. But nonetheless, we maintain aspects of that person we once were, and we're better for it the further we go into the future.
There you go. So let's make a sharp right here. Because you wanted to talk a little bit about your thoughts on the Kennedy assassination, which should be, when this is getting put up, is probably right on the anniversary, the 22nd of November. And you said you had a slightly different view of the whole thing.
Well, I don't know that I have a different view, and I'll try to be concise with full respect to the limitations of time and whatnot. But and also in an attempt to be thorough, I'll say this. These numbers may or may not really mean anything, but the recent NBC poll determined that around 62% of the American public still seems to feel that there's something going on beyond what we have been told.
I'm actually surprised it's that low.
Yeah. Oh, me too. And what's also funny is, I'm not necessarily like an avid reader of Slate magazine, but I've been reading a lot of their editorials that have been appearing online over the last several days. And the reason I've been reading their editorials is because they've probably been working the most stringently at trying to combat the conspiracist mode of thought in relation to the Kennedy assassination. One article had been written by, I think, oh gosh, what was it? It was he has some position with the Council on Foreign Relations, but Fred Kaplan is the writer. He had debunked the conspiracy theories regarding a second gunman, and at one point he got some of the facts wrong. And I'm doing a new podcast on Tuesdays along with Gralien Report called Middle Theory that we spent some time looking at this. And my co-host, Christopher McCollum, we call him McNonymous because we're so super serious about the way that we approach all this stuff. Never would advocate satire, especially when it comes to discussion of politics, history, and culture. McCollum had found the article, and I read it thoroughly, and I went over it, and I even wrote some about it. And then, as we're doing our show on Tuesday, he points out that there had been a correction to the article. And the correction had to do with a recording that had been made, where apparently a recording device on a policeman's motorcycle had been locked into the on position erroneously and had been streaming audio back to police headquarters, which was being recorded the entire time. And
right.
This audio appeared, some people have talked about this, and there was an episode of the popular program In Search Of back in the day. For those who would like to see it, it's on YouTube, and I recommend that you watch this. The YouTube episode of In Search Of is called In Search of Lee Harvey Oswald, where they discuss this piece of audio. Fred Kaplan, in his article, got some of the facts about that audio wrong and had to actually correct the article, or the editors there at Slate corrected it. And of course, inevitably, the person who, Fred Kaplan in this instance, who was writing about this and just debunking this as an element of the case, I still don't think that the way that the article presented that piece of evidence necessarily was conducive to assertions of there being a conspiracy. It didn't help conspiratorial claims by any means, but it was interesting nonetheless that he had to state that some of the facts he had gotten were wrong, and of course the way that he had stated those facts was preferentially biased toward a conventional viewpoint, i.e. a non-conspiratorial viewpoint toward the Kennedy assassination. 9 times out of 10, if a person wants to make a claim or use certain facts to justify their case and they get something wrong, what they get wrong, like we saw with Keel earlier, the misstated fact is going to lean toward propping up their opinion or their viewpoint. We see that some of the skeptics do this just as well. And that's not to demonize Kaplan or anyone else, but so what's interesting is that when you really dig into all this stuff, I don't think that with Kennedy we have to necessarily say that there was a second gunman. To me, what's more interesting is, and this is something that Kaplan said again in agreement with another person who's been a skeptic writing about this, he says, to me the real mystery is understanding what caused Lee Harvey Oswald to do what he did, if he was the gunman, and whether or not he acted alone, if he was involved in any capacity, which I think that there is evidence that he obviously was. What was the motivating factor that pushed Lee Harvey Oswald into getting into this. Because even if there had been a second gunman, the fact that he was acting means that there was something that was pushing him. What was his motivation? He obviously had a motivation. Was he a lone nut, or were there other entities involved?
Well, I think there's enough evidence to show that he was being very carefully handled by certain government people.
Yeah, there was the, we had talked, for instance, and I hope I don't mispronounce his name, but George de Mohrenschildt, I think, was a...
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and, he was the guy who had been involved with and spending a lot of time with Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife. And, he, of course, had been a wealthy oil geologist, I think was his actual title, his actual position. He spent a lot of time out of the country, traveled to South America quite a bit, and had been briefed by the CIA on a number of occasions. But that wasn't necessarily something that was uncommon for people who traveled out of the country during those years. That's something people need to keep in mind. So whereas today, if someone travels to South America and they come back and they're briefed by the CIA, you'd be like, Micah Hanks was just briefed by the CIA. He's probably working with intelligence. Back in those days, people of wealth and influence who traveled outside the country were routinely briefed by the CIA before or after, sometimes both. Or the FBI, for that matter. De Mohrenschildt was one who had undergone that kind of briefing on a few occasions, and happened to also be close with the Oswalds. But what's interesting to me is that, like we see with, and again, I'm sure there are many people who just think that I'm a crazy, kooky conspiracist, but like we see with the 9/11 Commission report, which stated scientific reasons for the collapse of the two towers. And whether you want to assert that there was a broader reaching conspiracy, I think there's a pretty obvious reason why the two buildings fell. If a plane smashes into a building, it's going to pretty severely damage the structural integrity of those buildings. But even at that point, and to this day, there are people who are structural engineers who say, yeah, but the buildings were designed to be able to withstand such an attack or such a collision.
Not only that, but over time it's now changed to it was office fires that brought down these buildings, and there are people who work in the steel industry who have said there's no way in hell office fires brought down those buildings.
Well, again, if the inertial movement of the collapse above the strike point on either or both of the Twin Towers was enough to bring down the buildings, and that there had been office fires that had greatly enough weakened the internal structure of the building to cause the collapse, and then the quote-unquote pancaking occurred as gravity and inertia worked together to literally bring these buildings completely to the ground. I could buy that because planes struck those buildings. The World Trade Center 7, however, was not struck by an aircraft, and yet it supposedly came down for the same reason. That cause, however, had not been determined by the time that the 9/11 Commission report was authored and published and presented to the public, which, when it was, apparently also completely left out any mention of World Trade Center 7, which is really strange to me. Now, we should also point out, by the way, and I do want to bring this back around to Kennedy, but I'm using the 9/11 thing as an example. Even the National Institute for Standards of Technology had issued a report, or actually a letter in response, I think, to an Infowars.com journalist, where they, and this is available online so anyone can look it up if they so choose, it acknowledges that I think the term had been utilized in the report, or in the letter, anomalous freefall, in relation to the collapse of the Twin Towers, the two buildings. And it is, according to the NIST, still undetermined what fully was the cause for the collapse of the buildings. That is interesting to me because, despite the fact that the National Institute for Standards of Technologies had been directly involved with the official investigation for the cause of the collapse of the two towers, journalistic organizations like Popular Mechanics can publish what they say is, without question, a definitive cause for the reason. And whether or not it contrasts, they will not acknowledge the anomalous freefall that an actual appointed agency under the United States government tasked with scientifically determining the cause. They still use the term anomalous freefall, and yet Popular Mechanics says, no question here, case closed, mystery solved.
Yeah.
And they don't even have to cite all their sources in the book where they actually explain it. Now, why, again, do the skeptics get away with this stuff? More important to me is the fact that we can't explain why a building that had no collision with an aircraft, it has been explained scientifically since then, but it was excluded from the 9/11 Commission report at the time, the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Why was that left out?
Well, here's the thing about that, though. It took them, 7 years to come up with a way that this building could have collapsed, but they weren't looking at it in a They were looking basically to support what the government told them happened, and how could this have happened in a scientific basis. They weren't looking in a sort of open, no holds barred sort of way of what would have brought this building down, because if they were, I'm guessing they would have found easier ways for this to have collapsed.
Oh, of course. Now, let's compare that with what happened with the Warren Commission report. In 888 pages of the Warren Commission report, one of the, what I consider to be significant developments with regard to the CIA and their investigation into the motivations of Lee Harvey Oswald was omitted from that Warren Commission report, and that was the testimony that was given and subsequent, I think, maybe 3 polygraph tests in the analysis subsequent to those tests being administered of an alleged former lieutenant with the KGB who defected to the United States named Yuri Ivanovich Nosenko. Yuri Nosenko in the early 1960s had been in Geneva, Switzerland. Switzerland, right? Not Sweden. All of a sudden I'm brain farting and I'm forgetting which is which here. And watch that now, the geographer's going to come after me here. But anyway, he'd been in Geneva, and Nosenko had apparently asked for a small sum of money, and I think that the CIA had employed him for something, and then he allegedly was... he claimed later that he was about to be recalled, or feared that he was going to be recalled back to Russia, and thought that he had been caught red-handed working for intelligence agencies in the West, and so he says he has to defect, and he comes to the United States. By the mid-1960s, he comes to the United States. He's working for the CIA and claims that he has some information about Lee Harvey Oswald. What he ended up saying was that although when Oswald, after being in the Marines, when he went to live in Russia for 2 years, although Oswald had been monitored by the KGB, and Nosenko even claimed that he had been involved in what would amount to an interview with Oswald, they found him to be too much of a nut. They didn't want to work with him. He was a nut. But when a polygraph test was administered to Nosenko, he failed when asked those questions about Oswald, which seemed to indicate that he was lying about the KGB's, non-involvement with Lee Harvey Oswald. And so why this is important is to take into consideration that, well, if this guy was a former KGB spy and he was offering information where he said, no, we didn't have anything to do with Oswald, and he failed the polygraph test. Furthermore, a second agent who was later proven, codenamed Fedora, but later proven to be a double agent who supported the same statements about Oswald, was found to be a double agent and was most likely giving bad information. When this information came out, paired with the fact that Nosenko failed the polygraph, it seems worthy of at least questioning the testimony being given about Nosenko, and what we can only infer from that is that what he was doing was he was lying about Oswald. Now, that does not directly mean conclusively that the Soviets, of course, had employed Oswald, or that he'd been a KGB spy, or that he was working with someone. And whether or not there was any conspiratorial element involving Jack Ruby, and I've read verbatim the transcript of the actual interview that the Warren Commission performed with Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby got pretty conspiratorial without saying that it was a conspiracy, but if people would like a more general overview of Jack Ruby, there's a Wikipedia page on him where they highlight some of the strange things that he had said, including claiming he was injected with cancer cells and things like that.
Yeah.
Jack Ruby got pretty far out there with it too, but without even asserting that there was a conspiracy of which he was a part of. We'll never know what Oswald actually was doing and what he might have told us, because Jack Ruby went in there and took it upon himself to kill the guy, as he states, to save Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie O, from having to come back and face him again in the trial.
Well, you also got the fact that the first thing Oswald said is that he was a patsy.
Yeah, Oswald, in fact, and this is the strange thing, nowadays you'd never allow somebody, a person who, again, innocent until proven guilty, but he's being paraded around in front of the press by the police. Did you kill Mr. Kennedy? Well, no, and that's not what I've been charged with. I only found about that out there in the hallway when they asked me about it. And if you want to watch on, I say asked because that's exactly how he pronounces the word, they interview him there on television, and Oswald, that's what he says. It's very interesting. I'm not saying that is necessarily proof that he didn't do it. I'm just saying, however, though, if we have only that to go off of in terms of what Oswald said, Oswald claimed he didn't do it.
We actually have very little evidence that Oswald actually did it.
Well, the thing is what we know about Oswald is that he was supposedly, well, here's the other interesting thing. The early CBS testimony about the man seen on the 4th floor of the book, the book repository, the early testimony had been that a young boy had said he'd seen a colored man up there in the building shooting, and then a Caucasian man was removed from the building. Now, of course, this was later found not to be Oswald, but Oswald was arrested, I think, after they found him in a theater after he had allegedly shot and killed a police officer on his way to that theater, leaving the scene of the crime.
Which is also open to question.
Yeah, it is, and there's a strange, I mean, it's really bizarre. I'm going to, shoot the president, and then I'm going to walk and I'm going to kill a police officer on my way to a movie theater. I'm going to go sit in a movie theater and watch a movie. And then I'm going to, be paraded around in front of the press after the fact, and when they ask me, did you shoot the president, I'm going to say, well, no. And interestingly, that's not what I was charged with, and I only found out about that out in the hall. That's a very interesting way of wording it. Not to assert, again, that he did or did not do it. I'm just, we're merely stating what Oswald actually said. I've studied pretty extensively not only what Jack Ruby told the Warren Commission, Chief Justice Earl Warren, and also future President Gerald Ford, who was, I believe, a senator at the time. I've not only studied that transcript and what Ruby had said, I've also studied, there's a book that you can buy, and I actually own it. It's called An Autobiography of Lee Harvey Oswald, My Life in Words, and it's a collected, what's a collection of all the writings and the interviews with Lee Harvey Oswald that basically tries to create sort of an academic survey of his worldview based on all the information. And there were television interviews with him because he was a self-proclaimed Marxist but not a communist. Lots of interesting things that can be said about him, and we have to take these kind of things into consideration as we conduct our survey of Lee Harvey Oswald, whom in truth I find far more interesting than most of the other key players in the Kennedy assassination. I think most people would agree, but what I mean is also that rather than focusing so much on the actual assassination and all these other people and all the other allegations of conspiracy and the people, including people who would go on to become presidents of the United States who were involved. Think about how many actually were involved, by the way. George Herbert Walker Bush may not remember where he was that day, but I think it's been pretty conclusively determined he had been in Dallas that morning.
Yep.
He would go on to be the CIA director, and then, of course, vice president under Reagan, and then, of course, president after that for one term, who famously more than once stated that what we need is a new world order. And when we succeed, and we will. I mean, come on, everybody remembers that. We also had Gerald Ford, who went on to become a president. Lyndon Johnson, of course, was vice president, was appointed president after that. And Nixon, who had run against Kennedy, became president when he was elected after the fact just as well, but wasn't directly involved in the Kennedy, anything going on with Kennedy at the time. But it's interesting how many presidents or future presidents were directly or indirectly involved. Now, that may sound like a weak case, but I think it's interesting.
It is.
Especially the fact that Gerald Ford had been a member of the Warren Commission. Well,
there was also a congressional committee during the 1970s that re-examined JFK and came to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy involved. And people seem to just gloss over that.
Yeah. At various times, there have been determinations. I mean, initially, I think that the consensus opinion was, prior to the investigation by the Warren Commission, that there was a conspiracy. It was widely believed. People did not believe that Oswald could act by himself. But again, and this is when you ask the question about the Kennedy assassination, and maybe this will be my living testament and statement about all this, is that we don't have to assert that there was a second gunman. What is most interesting to me is Lee Harvey Oswald. Let's say that everything that we know for the most part is accurate, but we still don't understand what motivated Oswald. And yet, when an ex-KGB agent comes to the United States, fails a polygraph. Now, granted, he also claimed that there was a doctor wearing a glove that inserted a finger into his rectum and twirled it around, and then alleged that he enjoyed that after the fact, which Nisenko claimed had been intended. Which Nisenko claimed had been intended to infuriate him and raise his blood pressure, so that it would actually affect the results of the polygraph. I think there were 3 polygraph tests administered to Nisenko, but we have to at least acknowledge that he did fail one when questioned about Lee Harvey Oswald's potential connection with the KGB. I don't know if that's good evidence or not, but it was left completely, even any mention of it, I believe, had been left out of the Warren Commission report, which I own, along with the 9/11 Commission report. And this is what's interesting to me, is that despite that information, which might give us at least some knowledge about a potential connection with Oswald and the Soviets. You know, the official inquiry doesn't seem to take much interest in that. Why would that be left out? You know, this may be the closest we'll ever come to knowing the potential truth about Oswald and his involvement with agencies or organizations and entities, or at very least what could have influenced him to act if he indeed did act alone, and yet no one seems to want to have to look at that. It's almost as though the American, you know, I don't know what you'd call it, but the people who are the adherents of the official narrative, as we'll call it, would rather that we have less knowledge, would rather that we know less. I'm a person who's fully an advocate of withholding from judgment until we are armed with the facts, and yet when there are facts that are so blatantly available to us and we choose not to observe those in our official inquiry, that, my friend, is very, very strange.
And one of the things I find interesting is when E. Howard Hunt came forth and gave his deathbed confession that he was at least approached about a plot to kill Kennedy. You know, it was immediately dismissed. People didn't even want to look at it, acknowledge it whatsoever. And I always find it funny that people say, well, if there was a conspiracy, someone would have talked. Well, wouldn't that count as somebody talking? Whether you believe him or not, he's doing exactly what you say someone would do if there was a conspiracy, and yet you're not going to look at that.
Yeah, and we don't believe in UFOs until a decent photograph's taken of one. And then when we actually get a good photograph of one, well, but this photograph isn't good enough. At what point does that confession become legitimate? At what point does a good photograph become good enough? At what point does the information become worthy of being included in the 888-page report that was the official inquiry by the Chief Justice at the time, the representative who would go on to become a U.S. president, and other people who were involved, including a district attorney who famously made the back into the left statement? You know, at what point does the evidence, which should be on the table and yet which is systematically ignored, become good enough? But then again, I'm probably just a crazy wacko woo-woo conspiracist, aren't I?
Well, you know, there's an analogy I like to use. When it comes to anything like this, I mean, short of actually having a time machine where we can go back and look, we're never going to know 100% what happened.
Well, I'm working on that. I hope to build a TARDIS in the next 5 years.
Because, I mean, you could be sitting in your living room and someone could throw a rock through your window. And you could run to the window and see a guy standing there right where someone should have been standing to throw that rock. And you could go out there and maybe they'll admit that they threw it. Maybe they'll tell you a story about someone else who ran by and threw the rock and they were waiting to tell you about it. And, I mean, this can go in any number of directions. He could be lying. He could be telling you the truth. He may have thrown the rock. He may not have thrown the rock. He might pick up a rock and go, look, I can't even throw the rock through the window, and limply throw it a few feet from you. And what do you make of that when that happens?
Yes, indeed.
And there's no way to fully prove without a camera that may have been on him, or without actually seeing what happened. There's no way you're going to know for sure. Maybe he's going to say he did it to cover for someone else.
Yes. And as we know from our study of physics experiments, that sometimes even a camera set up to observe apparent physical phenomenon is not good enough to explain the discrepancies between what is being observed and what, well, seems to occur naturally with or without the observational capacity brought into the equation just as well. That's strange, you know. I think, you know, some of our quantum scientists would say that the act of observing is actually what makes something relevant. And when there's no one there to observe it, if there's no man around to hear the proverbial tree falling in the woods, does it make a noise? And does it matter if it does or not? Sometimes I wonder if it really matters.
True. All right. Well, I'm going to let you go. And if people want to hear more from you, you now have three radio shows, podcasts that you're doing. Want to tell people about them?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. On Sunday nights on the KGRA, that's the Kansas City Global Radio Alliance, I'm doing the Micah Hanks program from 8 to 10. At the same time, on Tuesday nights, Eastern Time, we're doing the Gralien Report, and you can listen to that via gralienreport.com. And then finally, there's a new program also, which is called Middle Theory, also broadcasts in the mornings from 11 to 1 on Tuesdays Eastern Time, and that's going to be middletheory.com. And you can find Gralien Report and Middle Theory both on iTunes. If you like history, politics, current events, and maybe a touch of conspiracy from time to time, Middle Theory is going to be the show for you. And if you really want just some creepy goody kind of Fortiana and the strange and unusual, Gralien Report covers the rest of that.
And Gralien Report's also a lot of fun.
It is a more lighthearted fun. I mean, it's evolved a lot over the years, but I enjoy it. It's kicking back with my co-host and producer Tyler Pittman. You know, we cover everything from strange disappearances to histories, mysteries, UFOs. We might talk about science, you know, psychic phenomena. We're supposed to have Howard Bloom on the program here before long. So
Nice.
those are the kind of things that we discuss. Peter Robbins, a mutual friend of ours, he's been a guest on the program. You know, we discover a wide range of subjects. Sometimes if there's breaking news in the world of politics and the like, we'll get into that. But, you know, the reason I do separate programs is because I've hoped to be able to break things apart. You know, with the Gralians, we look at strange phenomena. Middle theory looks more at news and current events and politics. But no matter what, the same sort of thing that we've talked about throughout the duration of this conversation, Soraya, that middle ground that I always espouse, you plant yourself in the middle so that you're less biased, I guess, toward what you're observing, either for or against, right or left, day, night, life, death, whatever. You know, I try to say I think that we should maintain objectivity in all instances when it comes to trying to observe things going on in the world around us. And I try to do that both with Gralian and with middle theory.
And to question everything, especially what you think you believe.
Yes, what you think you believe, you're probably wrong in believing because, well, belief is the enemy, as John Keel said, and I'll leave you on that note. Belief, my friend, indeed is the enemy, and it remains such.
And what in your book?
Oh, yes. Well, the latest book is The Ghost Rockets, and that says it all. Mystery missiles and phantom projectiles in our skies. It's a very skeptical look at an element of ufology that is often overlooked altogether. And so you can find that on Amazon.com or at my website, MicahHanks.com.